Hello and welcome to the InfoQ podcast. My name is Wes Reisz and I chair the QCon software conferences brought to you by InfoQ. I'm also the host of the InfoQ podcast. The InfoQ podcast is a podcast directed towards senior devs, architects, and technical engineering leaders interested in the topics that you commonly will find on InfoQ.com and at QCon. Today I'm talking to Theo Scholossnagle. Theo is the founder and CEO of Circonus. Circonus is a fully automatable, API-centric microservice monitoring and analytics platform. Also is the creator of IronDB, a time series database. Theo is a member of the IEEE and a distinguished member of the ACM. In the ACM, he's a member of the Practitioners Board, and he currently co-chairs the ACM Queue's editorial board. On today's podcast, we discuss a pretty timely topic for software developers, ethics, specifically ethics in software. Today, with reports of fake news potentially influencing elections, state-sponsored actors using social media bot accounts to polarize entire communities of people, developers literally getting jail time for their involvement in emission scandals, and YouTube videos of AI-powered slaughter bots going viral, Theo is suggesting it's time for software to grow up and start asking questions that professions like law and medicine have for some time. Since I first talked to Theo about this podcast, I've really been looking forward to it. I hope you enjoy it, and thanks once again for joining the InfoQ podcast. Theo, welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So I got a small confession to make before we jump in. I'm not a regular reader of ACM Queue. I've known about it. I think I did a podcast with Katie McCaffrey on verification of distributed systems a while back, and I think that was my first exposure to it. But I'm a software developer. Why should I be reading ACM Queue?
I'm not a regular reader of QCon.
Fair enough.
I imagine that the answer is almost identical. They are timely, usually forward-looking perspectives on issues that affect practicing computer scientists. I think that most of the ACM Queue material has a forward-looking approach, but not pie in the sky. So try to limit our prospectus out about 18 months. So if you want to know what's coming down the track or what should be important to you, ACM Queue is a relatively small publication, but has great content.
Well, I'll tell you, in my defense, I did sign up last night. I will be a regular reader going forward. ACM Queue's got quite a bit of rigor. I mentioned when I talked to Katie, she had talked a bit about there's a lot of process that goes into planning these out too. It's not just here's an article and I publish it. What's that look like?
I actually really appreciate and enjoy the process that we use at Queue. This past year, I became one of the co-chairs of the Queue board, and a little bit more insight now than I had before to that. But what we do is we have a panel, it's a board of well-respected industry experts that have good networks, so they understand who is doing what. They keep their kind of ear to the grindstone, if you will. And what we do is we identify topics that we believe would be of interest to practitioners, and we try to recruit an expert that acts as a guest editor for an edition of Queue. So one of those experts would come in and brief the board on their area of expertise, why it's interesting, what's coming and going with that. And then I identify a set of articles and authors that would fairly represent the issue they'd want to read on their topic of expertise. So, and that's how those things are produced. Occasionally, people will kind of out of the blue contact us with an article that they think is appropriate. I would say that if they've already done that, they're probably right. It probably is appropriate, but that's pretty rare.
That's awesome. You just literally described how we put QCon together. It's that exact same model. It's just a conference. Wow, that's awesome.
I will say that there's a reason that museums and art galleries are so fantastic, and it all comes down to curation.
It's all about curation. Exactly right. So speaking of QCon, in London this March, you're part of a new track that we're doing, and it's Tech Ethics in Action. I mentioned a bunch of the things going on and kind of the introduction in the world today that's all about tech and affecting software. But the talk you're doing is called A Young Profession Coping with Ethical Debt. Love the play on words with ethical debt, first off, but why a talk on ethics? Why now?
Well, I am not an ethicist, so I will qualify the entire conversation in that way. However, I do study a lot and I read a lot, and I've been in the computing industry for the last 25 years. And what I've seen that's come out recently is that ethics are prevalent throughout society and they exist in all sorts of places. And when you think about why ethics become important and when we consider them appropriate, it usually has to do with broad implications on some sort of societal context. So everyone everywhere who works should understand the concept of professional ethics. Those are slightly different than domain-specific ethics like medical ethics or computing ethics or law ethics. But professional ethics are simply how you work as a professional with other people and a company and how you deal with that stuff. And because everyone does it, it's broadly applicable. I think that the entire, at least a subset of the Me Too movement, the challenges of professional ethics that were so obviously present and in lights at Uber indicate that we still clearly have professional ethics problems. And those are, I think, a lot easier to talk about. I'm not downplaying how difficult it is to service problems, but they're easy to talk about because I think everyone in the world agrees that professional ethics affects professionals everywhere. And that's kind of what it's about.
Makes sense, but why now? Why hasn't this surfaced before as something we needed to really focus on?
I think that if you rewind 50 years, there was seriously a concept that there would be, maybe 100 computers in the world and no one would really have to know them except for a few handful of people. That is patently false now, right? Every single person in the world will likely touch a computer in 15 years. And right now, every developed nation has a significant access to computers and societal influence by computers. So now we're at a point where the code we write and the problems we solve with computing actually affect a broad swath of society. And with that comes a responsibility. And ethics are a set of constructs and constraints for understanding how we act in that, to try to understand what's right and wrong, try to make sure we don't do wrong.
You mentioned in your response just a few minutes ago that there's a difference between professional ethics and domain-specific ethics. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
So ethics are, in general, a construct for kind of a systematic view of looking at what's right and wrong. They dictate intentions and actions. Given the domain you're working in, the actions that you would take are incredibly different, right? So if you're in medicine, your actions are focused on the health of the patient, the well-being of the patient, the privacy of the patient. There's trust involved, right? So being trustworthy in that. That doesn't apply the same way to business ethics, where you're trying to strike a deal and you're working from one company to another or from a company to a consumer. And you talk about what's right and wrong in the transactions that you would do there. So basically, in any domain, you're doing transactions or a complex set of actions. And you have to evaluate whether those actions are for good or for bad, or as I would say, for good or not for good. And I think that that's why professional ethics seem very broad, because you're like, oh, it's about every profession. It's not really about every profession. It's about being a professional. It's about working in a professional context.
So, how do you respond to the developer who says, I wrote a piece of code, I didn't compose it to do that type of thing? Like there's an example I think you and I talked about when we first talked a bit about Slaughterbots, which is a viral video out from Stuart Russell that's kind of talking about these drones that have the ability to do crazy stuff. Go watch it. I won't spoil the video for you if you haven't seen it. But how do you respond to the developer who said, I didn't write a Slaughterbot. I just wrote a facial recognition software that was used in it?
I don't think that that's an incorrect statement at all. I mean, we are all just writing software for the use cases that we have. They're obviously using a set of software to directly hurt individuals, right? To not do good. Don't do evil is a really low bar to set in general, right? It's not the absence of doing evil; it's actually the presence of doing good, right? So you really want to aim at that. So if you're building software and it is not there to do good, which is a hugely challenging conversation in and of itself, then we have a problem. Now, if you're building a piece of software that's incorporated by another piece of software that's incorporated by another piece of software, which is basically everything that gets written today, that indirect influence on that is something that you obviously can't control, but it is something that you can contemplate. And I think really that's what our job is. Our job is not to police that, but to police ourselves in that.
Obviously, the example I gave was easy to say. It's just a component that I didn't know was going to be done in that way, so I can kind of wash my hands of it. But let's talk about something specific like machine learning. I build a system that uses a black box model. I just built a system. I didn't know what was in the model. It's not my fault that it completely alienated a whole group of people. Somebody could respond, no?
Well, I would argue if you are building a model to take actions for people, that it is your ethical responsibility to understand the model that's building on that. I mean, you're affecting human lives directly in that case.
But let's be honest, not all developers are going to understand the math behind the models that are being used to make decisions. In fact, I mean, I argue that a large percent of people at some of the biggest Valley shops don't understand the model itself that's making some of these decisions. Those are pretty deep neural networks.
There are also things that you can do. It's like understanding the models that go into voting districts. No one can really understand I'm sure in the United States, people can often understand the horrible models that go into building voting districts. There are mathematical methods and approaches that we can use to actually ratify that those things are fair afterwards. So even though you don't understand the input model, which I would say that it's worth understanding what the input model is, even if you can't reason about the machine that processes that model. But it's also completely reasonable to expect a test of that model to make sure that you're deploying a system that is assigning credit estimates to people. It's really important that we understand what our society is, who it's made of, and to make sure that those assessments are fair.
There's a lot of stuff that I've read lately about interpretability of machine learning models where you can actually understand why a model made a particular decision, not just you were voted down on a particular credit card, for example.
Right. I think that I'm a pessimist in that realm. I know that there's been some requests for action from government in general to provide some sort of transparency, algorithmic transparency. It turns out it's hard to be algorithmically transparent on something like a binary search. It is very difficult to describe algorithms to a non-computing professional. So computational thinking is not part of traditional curriculum in the United States, for example. So the concepts are slightly foreign. And then as they get more complicated, when you start doing large linear algebra, for example, which is common in machine learning, I think the ability to reason about those things is hard, and the ability to explain them is kind of misplaced. I think that explaining algorithms in English is very hard. So I think that accountability for algorithms can be enforced other ways. So there was recently a fantastic presentation at a conference called Monktoberfest. It was on gerrymandering. And what it talked about is they used machine generation to generate hundreds of thousands of possible maps, like just randomly generate reasonable maps for certain states and voting districts to see how much winner take all would happen in an election. And they built a distribution model around it and said, if we don't know better, our distribution of winner take all probabilities and this should look like this. It should be in this curve, this bell curve. And the one that's there is outside the bell curve, like undeniably outside the bell curve. And it's like, this is not partisan. This is random. This is a computer generating 100,000 models and saying, there's no way you could have reasonably gotten yourself this far outside the bell curve without intent, which is really cool, right? You don't actually have to understand how the map was constructed. You don't have to understand the motivations. All you have to understand was it was significantly outlying from what like is generally a reasonable outcome.
So let's get back to this talk at QCon London. So how are you going to start to frame this question of ethics for software developers?
I think it's really important to understand where ethics come from and how people reason about ethics. So we'll start off by just talking about what ethics are, right? They're systems and constructs for explaining right and wrong, whether those are motivations or actions arguable by ethicists. And there's generally three schools of thought around ethics. The two most popular are deontology, which is rules-based ethics, rules and duties. And then there's consequentialism, which is all based on the outcome. And then there's a smaller one, which is not as commonly represented, which is virtue-based ethics. And they are all talking about the exact same thing. They are through different lenses, and they try to justify and construct the world of ethics through those different lenses. For computer scientists, the duty or rules-based ethics has a natural appeal, mainly because, even in ethics works and in written ethics works by non-computer scientists, they talk about the codification of ethics, right? And you're like, oh, code, it's predicates and it's rules, and rules have priority over other rules. So basically, in order to be ethical, I just need a really good rule set, and I can follow it. I'm good at that because I know computing. I think that's really dangerous, specifically because we are such a young industry and our industry changes dramatically. There's this concept that if I apply a rule of ethics from 400 BC to today, if it was a great rule of ethics, that'd be great. However, society's changed. Humans have changed. Our understanding of human society has changed, right? So those rules, they don't make sense. I'll give a couple of examples of those. Some of them will be probably controversial, of how that has changed, specifically like in medicine. You look at the Hippocratic Oath, which you mentioned earlier. There's some stuff in there that kind of implies, one, a grossly antiquated view of the world, and another is a recently antiquated view of the world. And they're there, and we can't deny that the world changes. So those things change. Problem with computing is that all that change is compressed over about 60 years, and it's still changing. So instead of having a set of rules that we follow that are most likely going to be incorrect and outdated soon, I think that we really need to start from more of like a virtue ethics standpoint. We really just need to be asking questions about what are the virtues we expect to achieve, right? What are the admirable virtues of computing, of delivering software, and what do we do to try to aim at those goals, right? How do we try to ask ourselves questions instead of following rules? You say, is this right, for some definition of right? So we need to ask ourselves questions about what is right look like in computing, and then ask ourselves those questions as we do our jobs, not disruptively.
So as I'm writing some software, it should achieve the given use case, of course, but we should also be saying it should not allow someone, for example, to be able to violate the safety of someone else online. Is that an example of a type of ethical question?
That's a great example, right? So you have issues of privacy and intentional or consequential information disclosure that can put someone at risk. So the question is privacy something that we want to guarantee as something that's right in computing? My argument is yes, maybe heavily slanted on the fact that I'm an American. I think a right to privacy is a fundamental human right. The idea that a piece of software that is widely used, if it either intentionally does it, which is just flat out evil, or it encourages the accidental disclosure or forfeiting of one's privacy, those are ethical considerations you should take into consideration. A great example is, I mean, if we look back 15 years, anybody who's done operations or even ran a Unix box, right? When you started it up, it ran everything. It ran a telnet server, it ran a finger server, it ran everything, right? Because why wouldn't you turn everything on? It took a long time for us to do this secure by default sort of mindset. To me, that was us looking at the ethics of giving someone a platform that they open themselves up to the world with, right? And that's not a really good first stance to take.
So does this imply then a certain rigor needs to be applied to ethics? For example, with security, we talked about, we have threat models and we establish kind of boundaries and what are the threats that may be at some of those boundaries. And we do defense in depth and all kinds of things like this from those. Do we need to take an approach like that with ethics?
I think that security of all of the various kind of sub practices within computing is the one that has historically been most faced with ethical challenges. And when you're faced with more challenges, you build more models and you build more sophisticated reasoning around that. So I would say that the security kind of sub practice of computing is significantly ahead when it comes to factoring in ethical concerns in the work that they do.
Can you give me some other examples maybe that you have that a software developer should be thinking about from ethical foxhole?
There are so many of them. I mean, the current state, the last 3 or 4 years of computing in practice has given us ample opportunities to cry on behalf of humanity. So there are cases at Uber where you require a license in San Francisco to operate a car without a driver, right? Autonomous cars require a license, and they knowingly deployed these. It takes a lot of people to actually get a piece of hardware on the road with a computer in it, and they knowingly elected to disrupt the system by ignoring the laws, right? And we are social beasts. Humans are social beasts, right? We are social species. We live in society. The society is governed by rules, right? It's absolutely critical to follow those rules, right? You have to obey the law. It's an ethical principle. So that was a highly orchestrated, interdisciplinary ethical violation in order to get that car on a road that could run a red light and run over a kid. That's crazy, right? And then if you look at one it's even more subtle, Volkswagen, the gaming of the emissions constraints. So, right, you have the ethical concerns of environmental damage, right? So protecting shared resources is something that's important. The earth is a shared resource. So we have these laws in particular that dictate exactly how cars are supposed to behave with respect to emissions. So they knowingly made the product run in a different mode when it was being tested. Right. So that's a gross ethical violation. I think someone's in jail for that, right? But there's even more subtle ethical violations that could have happened, right? So it's talk about optimizing. For what are you optimizing? Right? Are you optimizing for a good driving experience in a clean environment? Or do you actually optimize for the test? Right. So they could have optimized for the test in a way that it didn't run in a different mode while it was on the road versus in a test. It still really wouldn't be ethical. Right. So you have to kind of consider, what am I building? Why am I building it? Who will it hurt? And I think that in the Volkswagen case, it's pretty clear that they just damn game the system. But I think that they could have even been more subtly in violation of ethics by building a model. It's like teaching to the test. Are you teaching a kid to learn the material and succeed in life, or are you teaching them to pass the test? And that's ethics in education, right? That's a complicated problem. We have that same problem here, especially with machine learning. As machine learning, the entire premise of machine learning is fed off of models. We have a lot of election to choose one model over another, and we have to understand why we're doing that and making sure that the reason is motivated upon good.
So, as a senior leader in software, architect, or even management leader, I mentioned the threat model, for example, before. How do you put practices in place to make sure your teams, your groups are making ethical decisions, and that's part of the decisions they're making? How do you do that?
I think it is going to require very comprehensive industry reform, is what I think. I think that we're going to need to see more publications cover the topic, both on, we've always had these write-in columns where you're like, oh, I was hacking with my colleague and he won't adopt test-driven design. How do I convince him? And it's like an advice column, right? We probably need an advice column on ethical considerations. We need exposés of ethical violations. And I think that we need to start adopting a culture of questioning the ethical underpinning of the work that we're doing. And I will agree that if you're a junior dev or even a senior dev, and you're building a highly isolated component that's doing like string matching or something like that, that's probably going to be a very short conversation. You say, gosh, what are the ethical concerns of this? And it's like, I don't see any. We should ask ourselves tomorrow over beers and spend another 60 seconds thinking about this. But the closer you get to a human being with those implementations, the more those concerns become tangible.
Are we getting to a point where we need a Hippocratic oath for computing?
I think that the answer to that today is no, but it is coming. It is coming very quickly. The reason that we have the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, or at least my revisionist history reason why we have the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, is because the application of medicine has ubiquitous societal impact. If you're like me, you think every single person is entitled to, has a human right to well-being. And well-being really requires healthcare. It requires, medicine. So in order to supply that, you need to do that in a way that is beneficial to society and to the individual. Why? Because it affects all of society. Computing, like I said, 60 years ago, affected 10, 100 people, 1,000 people. Now it affects billions of people. It is quickly becoming the underpinning of all of human interactions in society, and it will be the underpinning of everything soon. Very, very soon. There will be no humans on Earth that communicate without touching technology. It's coming. And with that ubiquitous presence, it is paramount that people that build and operate as professionals in that industry have something like a Hippocratic Oath.
Well, Theo, thanks for taking up the mantle to start at least having the discussions about ethics in software.
If I can bring questions, I think I've succeeded.
So if you want to hear more about Theo Scholossnagle's discussion on ethics and you want to engage with the conversation, make sure to check out his talk at QCon London. And if you missed it in person, it will be published online at infoq.com over the months following. Theo, thanks as always for chatting with us.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.